So this lesson is on Hebrew accents, which are not to be confused with Hebrew vowels. Just take a deep breath when I say this. You don't need to know these. I will tell you when it's something where you absolutely have to memorize and learn it. This is something I just need to tell you because as you get these handouts, I did not start off putting all of the Hebrew accents on. And somewhere in the middle, I decided, oh, I better add the accents, and I did. So halfway through, you're going to see some of these, I think, by verse 5 or so, I started adding in all the accents. Well, some of you, I'm sure, saw, and they're saying, what are those? Don't think, oh, no, now I have to memorize all of this. No. I don't even have them memorized, and I think I have a good mastery over the Hebrew language. I know them, I know when I see them, I know what they represent, but it's not necessary for you. I just need to mention. There are 27 what are called prose accents and 21 poetic accents. In the Psalms, Proverbs, and Job, we are primarily dealing with those 21 poetic accents. Now remember, a week or two ago I was doing a lesson on syllables. And I said if you're reading, now you'll know why I say certain things. If you're reading a grammar book and they keep using the word, the accent must fall on. And I said I prefer to use the word stress because being familiar with the language, I understand that there are accents and I didn't want there to be confusion in terminology. So you'll understand when I said to you, it's really hard for me to recommend a book because they'll use terms that can be rather confusing down the road. And if you have no one to explain this to you, it just exacerbates the situation. So accents are accents in any language, things that are added, little markings that are not vowel points. So there are two main uses with Hebrew accents. One, if you remember, we did a lesson on syllables and we showed that in syllable separation we had tonic, we had tonic, pretonic, and propretonic in terms of the breakdown of syllables. Tonic or tone being the stress place, and each one moving away because Hebrew reads opposite of English. Some of you were greatly confused and didn't understand why it was pretonic. That would mean it comes before, but if you're reading Hebrew in the right direction, it makes perfect sense. It's reading backwards from English. So if you remember that lesson, and you remember that I said the tone or the tonic is that usually last syllable. So Hebrew will use accents to show you if, for some strange reason, the tone or the syllable does not fall in the usual place, all right? So the first accent I would like you to just be familiar with, you don't need to memorize this. It's just something that you'll see in my writing. You might say, what is that? So the first one I want you to know about is called a Munah. It's this little elbow that sits around, and I've given you some examples. In fact, I've given them right out of our psalm. So in the 6th verse, Psalm 91, verse 6, you see this, I circled it, but right here underneath, there is a Munah. And in verse 9, there's a Munah. And in verse 13, likewise. It's simply showing you that for some reason, the syllable does not fall where it should. And that's your little reminder to say, hey, this is an exception, this is different. So that's what the Munah does. If a word doesn't have a Munah, it's safe to say the syllable, the stress will fall on the last syllable. It's pretty safe to say that. By now, you've seen, either by my handouts or by, if you're trying to follow along in a parallel Bible, you've seen that Hebrew does not have the same punctuation marks as English does. And there's a few things I think I might have forgot to tell you, just assuming that you would know that. Hebrew does not have punctuation marks like English does. In fact, one of the craziest things is I haven't told you what a period looks like to finish a sentence, because I've just been writing out verses thinking we're just randomly doing verses. So I'd like you to see at the end of a sentence, remember the sentence is reading this way. So you're reading your sentence, and then you encounter these two dots. That is the equivalent, it's called a sof pasuk, and that's the equivalent of an English period. It's helpful for you to know that, because you might be reading a Bible or something and see those two dots and say, what on earth is that? Pastor Scott never mentioned that. So I want you to at least know that's what the Hebrew equivalent of the end of, that tells you end of verse. All right? The verse is over, those two dots occur. The next thing that is probably and equally important is this. There are two types of accents, disjunctive and conjunctive. So disjunctive accents, there are two I just want you to see. There are plentiful on these handouts. One of them is called Athnach, and it just looks like that. It's got that little arrowhead, and I've given you some examples right here in verse 6. One of the words in verse 6, one of the words in verse 8, and I put verse 14. You don't have that yet. I'm going to tell you what that is for, what that Athnach is for, and something called a Silluq. And a Silluq also happens to appear, I'll show you right here. This is imaginary, it's not true, but it'll appear just like that. Now, if you've been reading over these handouts, you'll see that there are plenty of markings. This is the brilliance of doing some of this background work. We know that chapter and verse came at a much later time. And when we read Hebrew, we see, if you're reading from at least some of the sources I've shown you, the Aleppo Codex and the Leningrad, there are no chapter and verse divisions. So a lot of these markings were added by the Masoretic folks, the family that was the primary family. There were three, the primary Tiberian source, calling this what is called the Masorah, which is a whole bunch of accents to help us know how the early readers of the text without chapter and verse would have understood where a break was, where a pause was, for example, and I think I've put this out pretty clearly, so I'll read from what I've given you here. These accents serve somewhat like punctuation marks, showing how the text may have been understood, read, or perceived pre-chapter and verse. So as accents and punctuations, they're either disjunctive or conjunctive. Disjunctive, I just gave you the first line up here, these two, Athnach and Silluq. The Silluq is placed below the accented syllable of the last word. Listen to this. In the last half of the verse. In other words, if you were trying to find out how they divided up the verse back then, how the early readers and disseminators of the text divided it up, they used this mark. That was to determine the last syllable accented in the syllable of the last word in the last half of a verse. If you were looking for clues, you would also go to the end of the sentence and look for the sof pasuk, and the word that comes right before it or in line having this would at least give you the clue, giving you something to identify with. So I gave an example here of the last portion of verse 14. So the last part of ki yada, because he knows, kind of interesting. We read through this because he knows name of me or my name. And you'll see the line will occur right here. It is on the last syllable. The Silluq is on the last syllable of the last word, and then the end of the sentence occurs. So it helps to identify what's in the text. The Athnach, see if I have anything on here. This marks the first half of the verse. So wherever this occurs in whatever word in a verse, and let's see if we can find an example. I said verse 6. So let's see if this all is true here. Let's get one of these markers and see if we can find verse 6. I see, I'm going to circle a bunch of things here, and then I'll turn your way. I see a Munah. I see a lot of divisions here. All right. See if you can see that from that far away. 3 examples of what I just taught on here. There's an example of a Munah right there. It's telling you that the syllable doesn't fall where it ought to. It's falling, strangely enough, in the middle of somewhere it shouldn't. So you've got that little marker right there. Here's an Athnach. This is telling you the end of the first part of the verse. And down here is a Silluq, telling you this is the end, the last syllable and end of the verse, which should conclude with ... Sof pasuk. So you might ask the question, I mean, it really is it's a noteworthy question. How on earth did they separate these things if we take for granted chapter and verse? We open up the Bible, open chapter and verse. But these are all the helps that were added. Now, granted, these helps were added somewhere around, we've said, maybe 900, 1,000. In the most complete manuscripts, at least, we have record of that. So there has to be at least an understanding, if you were to look at a codex, Leningrad or the Aleppo Codex, at least some understanding of what these marks are. They're not, the scribe got tired and he put his pen and ink down there and it made a couple of marks. You should know what they are. So next time we display some of those manuscripts for you, which I'd like to do another display like we did with Wycliffe, because I've got some other things I'd like to share with you eventually. You'll be able to pass by and at least know what you're looking at, not just it's all Hebrew, but you'll be able to see. And I think the other noteworthy thing is, at some point I'd like to bring out a chart and hopefully get it in a handout size to show you the development of what we now call calligraphy, or the development of the fancier writing within the Hebrew text. You'll be able to identify, well, you don't have to become an expert, but you'll be able to identify the approximate timeline and provenance of some of these manuscripts just by looking at how the letters appear. It's really very interesting. You only have to see it once or twice, and then when you walk by some of these manuscripts, lights will go off and say, that's an early 12th century manuscript, and that came from Yemen. That has to come from Yemen. That's the way they were writing the letters there. That came from North Africa. That's their technique over there. You begin to get familiar with these things. So it's just a good overall tool, but then it's going to make you appreciate some of the manuscripts and Torahs and scrolls a lot more, believe me. So we have the Munah, the Athnach, the Silluq, and one last one, 3 last words, and then I said it was a short lesson. You're going to love this. Actually, no, you're going to hate this. So Hebrew does some very weird things. These are the great things. These little lines for me are so helpful. But sometimes what makes me angry is you think they could have come up with a different name. So this is a Silluq, but it's also called a Meteg. And sometimes I'm giving you the nice version. Gosh darn it, couldn't you guys figure out how to use some other marking? Because if you're just learning, you say, well, why did they use the same line and call it something else? I don't know. But It looks exactly like the Silluq, but it's not. But it's really easy to tell it apart. Remember, I just said to you the Silluq appears at the end. It's right at the end of a sentence, right before the version of the period occurs, okay? If this appears anywhere else in the sentence, you know it's a Meteg. Don't you just want to go strangle somebody? All right. So, the purpose of a Meteg, which, not to be confused with a Silluq, all right, is to make the reader slow down. And actually, it's like putting on the brakes. So, the Meteg anywhere else, this line anywhere else functioning as a Meteg, is going to almost act like our version of a comma. It helps you to take a little bit of a breath, and it slows you down. So the Meteg is something we are going to revisit much further down the road. I'm introducing you to concepts that normally, if you were doing this type of study in a college or university classroom, you probably would get the brief overview, and at least maybe a year down the road you'd revisit these. I'm planning on revisiting them once we have dealt with nouns and have got some mastery over the nouns. We'll come back and we'll see how this is going to be helpful. So that is the Meteg. Wait, there's more. Let's go to a new page. The next one, the next accent, you may buy books or read books, and it may read for you, some of you readers, it may read Maqqef, or it may read Maqqef. And why is that? Because somebody couldn't figure out if it should be accented or not in the Hebrew writing of this word. I prefer to tell you that it is a f. Don't ask me why, but that's the way I've always known it, as a Maqqef. This word in the Hebrew means to bind, connect, or as a connection or a connector. And this one's quite easy to identify. You don't have to study or memorize this too long to know. This is like the equivalent, it looks like the equivalent of an English hyphen. And it occurs between two words. I know you've seen this before. You might be saying, where? Give me an example. And I shall do just that. So, we have a perfect example in verse 10. There are many others. I'm going to tell you, go in your own time. This is going to be part of your work. Go and find all the Maqqefs in Psalm 91, and there's plenty of them. But here's one right here. Just looks like a hyphen that's real high. It's not between the letters. It's connecting. Now, you say, well, what's the point of that? Well, think of it this way. A Maqqef is like a marriage between two people. It makes them become one. So this two separate words actually become or are seen or understood as one. If you were trying to find terminology for you people who are diehard grammarians, the first word in the marriage is called proclisis, and the second one is called a proclitic. It belongs to the first. So, having said that, what does that mean in layman's terms? Can you simplify that for me? I sure can. So, a word in Hebrew that is bound by this Maqqef would be analogous to what Texans do. They take you all and they make it y'all. All right? So imagine that. It's not slang, but imagine that it's the marriage of two words coming together, becoming one. And there's a lot of grammar rules that are going to kick in later on. But I just want you to get familiar with some of these markings. You might say, what are all these scratchy things? I'm explaining what they are. And then you begin to say, okay, I see more of them. So your job is to go in now on your handout and find all of the Maqqefs all of the Athnachs, all of the Silluqs. Now there's going to be other markings we haven't covered yet, but you can at least identify those. They'll help you get familiar with, and as you can see in these handouts, I've isolated the verse. So it would be self-evident that at the end of each, for example, verse 9, there would be a dot dot saying that is the sof pasuk or the end of the verse. Look what's right here. You have the Silluq right there. So in each one of these, you're going to find the same thing. And I didn't put all the accents in. You purists are going to say, "What? There's some missing in the beginning." That's right, because I said halfway through, I decided I'm going to put in everything here so I can explain it to you. So perhaps at some time when you get proficient, you can fill in the missing accents in the first few pages. Yeah? All right. I'm believing that for some of you. You'd have the same thing here. End of verse, dot, dot, which would be like our period. There is your Silluq. All right? So that is that portion. And the last thing, the very last thing, and I'm introducing this tonight, we will come back to it, is it's something called quiescence, or I've put on my handout here, shh, be quiet, because basically I have these little things as I go through these lessons. I think, how did I learn these things, and what applications did I make to keep the rules simple? Quiescence are letters, for example, like Aleph. Let me write them out for you, but you should know that. Aleph is a quiescent, and He is a quiescent. There are other letters that may be considered sometimes quiescent, such as Vav and Yod, but these are the two primary ones. And what happens, sometimes these, Aleph and He, will occur at the end of a word, and they will not carry their full consonant meaning, and they will actually, their value will disappear. They become quiet. It's a fancy term, quiescence, quiet letters. This becomes important. And again, I said we'll cover this later. Quiescence will become important when I introduce prepositions and definite articles. Prepositions, and I'll just give you this brief overview. It's not part of this handout. Prepositions in the Hebrew are usually letters attached to a word, but they begin independent. And usually there are three primary prepositions in Hebrew. The lamed, which is to, sometimes used to signify the accusative. The bet, again, these are not hard rules, they change, but bet, so to, bet can be in or with or upon, and the key. So I'm sorry, this was a bet, vet, depending on what's put in here, and key. Key. So, which can be like, to, as. These will get attached to words which we have in our psalm, and they'll become connected. Unlike in English, where a definite article is separate and a preposition is separate, in Hebrew, the definite article and or the preposition and or both, they attach themselves to the noun or the verb, and they become a part of the word. So the quiet the quiet consonants, learning the rules will become important if these occur at the beginning of a word and if they are attached to a preposition or a definite article, which actually looks like a hey with a little line underneath it. So I'm just giving you a brief introduction as to why I'm giving you some of these. They seem rather tedious to learn. Well, why do we need to learn this? Because when we get into learning about the real meat and potatoes of, as I just said, prepositions and definite articles and even nouns, you're going to at least want to know, hey, what happened to that noun? It looks different now. Is it the same word? Yes, but something happened because these consonants were not able to sustain their value. We'll cover it. It sounds much more complicated than it is. It's very simple, I guarantee you.